Hello everyone, and welcome to my CBS Full Today channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. In Genoa City, backstabbings infrequently stay buried for long, but when they surface, they've a way of crumping lives in slow, agonizing swells. And this time the shockwave began with Victoria Newman standing alone in her office at Newman Enterprises long after evening, the megacity lights glowing like silent substantiations as she goggled at the substantiation spread before her, documents and digital lines that told a story she no way wanted to read yet could no longer deny. Evidence that Holden's fidelity was a precisely drafted vision, a web of calculated infidelity that reached far beyond a single reckless mistake and rather revealed a pattern of deception so precise it framed on strategy. And as Victoria absorbed the verity, the weight of it pressed against her casket not just as a businesswoman or a Newman, but as a woman who had spent her life learning that trust was a currency more precious than plutocrat and far more dangerous to give down. The substantiation was inarguable: private hostel bills masked under shell accounts, discreet transfers timed to commercial trip schedules, and surveillance prints that left no room for interpretation. And yet what disturbed Victoria most wasn't the treason itself but the name that kept surfacing in the perimeters of the timeline: Claire, whose propinquity to Holden had formerly sounded inoffensive, indeed coincidental, but now glowed like a warning light Victoria could no longer ignore. And as recollections replayed in her mind, subtle ganders, moments that had felt slightly out but readily to dismiss, she realized with a sickening clarity that Claire had been ringing a taradiddle, willingly or not, and that consummation stoned Victoria's resoluteness into commodity cold and unmistakable. By the time she summoned Claire to see her, Victoria had formally made her decision, not as an impulsive response but as an advised act of protection, because Victoria Newman didn't survive decades of particular and professional warfare by scrupling when peril revealed itself, and when Claire entered the room, ignorant that her life was about to cock on its axis, Victoria saw not an adversary but a liability, someone standing too close to a fire she hadn't started yet couldn't escape unburned. And Victoria wasted no time softening the verity, explaining with measured perfection that Holden's infidelity wasn't rumor or dubitation, but fact, backed by substantiation that would destroy reports if released. And as Claire plotted to reuse the information, Victoria delivered the warning that would echo long after the meeting ended, making it clear that whatever Claire believed she participated with Holden was erected on manipulation, secretiveness, and calculated treason, and that continuing any form of connection, particular, professional, or emotional, would not only jeopardize Claire's future but invite consequences from forces far less forgiving than Victoria herself. The warning wasn't cried, not dramatic, but devastating in its restraint, because Victoria didn't need to hang when the verity itself carried similar power. And as Claire left the office shaken, the graveness of Victoria's words settled into her like a storm pall, forcing her to defy the possibility that she had been used as a distraction, a cover, or worse, an accessory to a deception she no way acceded to. While across city Holden remained blissfully ignorant that the walls around him were formally closing in, his precisely maintained image unraveling thread by thread as Victoria still mustered her coming moves, icing that the fallout would be contained yet unrecoverable, because while Victoria's warning to Claire was embedded in protection, it was also a protestation of control, a memorial that when lines are crossed in Genoa City, the consequences aren't always immediate but they are always exact. And as the night strengthened and the megacity slept, Victoria stood formally more at her window, completely apprehensive that her intervention had altered multiple circles at formally, knowing Claire would either heed the warning and vanish from Holden's route or defy it and discover firsthand just how enduring the Newman heritage could be. And in that moment, Victoria felt no satisfaction, only the familiar, heavy certainty that in a world erected on secrets, survival belonged to those willing to act before the verity destroyed everyone in its path. In the fate of Victoria Newman's warning, the ripples moved through Genoa City with deceptive quiet, the kind that frequently precedes desolation, and Claire set up herself drifting through familiar spaces that suddenly felt hostile, every hallway and coffee shop echoing with implied questions she was no longer suitable to silence, because formerly mistrustfulness took root it spread presto, infecting recollections she had formerly trusted, moments she had replayed fondly now reassembling themselves into commodity darker and far more unsettling. And as she redefined her history with Holden through this new lens, the inconsistencies multiplied, The last nanosecond cancellations that were always explained down with business extremities, the emotional distance that came and went without warning, the precisely curated charm that had formerly felt reassuring now reading as performance, and while Claire tried to move herself that Victoria's warning had been motivated by commercial paranoia or particular bias, the substantiation Victoria had laid out so methodically refused to loosen its grip, especially the consummation that Holden's backstabbings were insulated but methodical, woven seamlessly into his routine as if deception itself were alternate nature. Meanwhile, Victoria didn't retreat after delivering her warning, because stepping back had no way been her style, and from her edge point within Newman Enterprises she began tensing the net with quiet effectiveness, reviewing contracts, reconsidering alliances, and checking Holden's professional footmark for sins that imaged the particular bones he believed he'd concealed, and in doing so she uncovered a disquieting imbrication between his infidelity and his business pushes, patterns suggesting that particular treason and commercial opportunism were feeding off each other, each lie enabling the coming, which only corroborated Victoria's belief that allowing Claire to remain anywhere near Holden was a threat that extended beyond heartache into genuine professional jeopardy. Across city, Nikki tasted the shift in her son nearly incontinently, not through dramatic admissions but through subtle changes in tone and timing, the way Victoria grew quieter at family gatherings, further deliberate in her movements, and Nikki understood that when Victoria moved like this, it meant she was preparing for impact, a familiar prelude to storms that frequently left lasting scars, and though Nikki didn't press for details, she watched nearly, apprehensive that whatever was unfolding would soon demand fidelity lines be drawn. As days passed, Claire's internal conflict boosted, torn between defying Holden and conserving the vision that had formerly made her feel safe, yet every commerce with him now felt simulated, his solace concave, his charm decreasingly rehearsed, and when she tested him with small questions meant to gauge honesty, his answers slid too fluently into place, attesting what Victoria had inferred without ever demanding to say audibly, that Holden was complete at telling people exactly what they wanted to hear, and this consummation left Claire scuffling with a sharp, humiliating mindfulness that she hadn't only been deceived but strategically deposited, whether as cover, convenience, or influence, a possibility that eroded her sense of agency and left her questioning how deeply she had been compromised. While Holden continued to operate under the supposition that his double life remained complete, subtle shifts around him gestured else, meetings tallied without explanation, phone calls unanswered, access delayed, and though he originally dismissed these changes as commercial politics, a familiar game in Genoa City, apprehension began to creep in when he noticed Victoria's unmistakable absence from his usual channels, because Victoria Newman no way disentangled without intention, and her silence felt louder than battle. At the same time, whispers began circulating through the business community. Not overt allegations but refocused enterprise, the kind that thrived on half-trueness and careful elision, suggesting that Holden's character was no longer as untouchable as he believed, and as these murmurs reached Claire, they compounded her insulation, because she could neither defend him with conviction nor condemn him without entwining herself in the narrative, leaving her suspended in a limbo that stripped down her confidence and forced her to reckon with the consequences of ignoring her instincts for far too long. Victoria, watching these developments from her advised distance, felt no triumph, only a grim sense of ineluctability, because she had learned long ago that exposure was infrequently clean, that verity frequently arrived in fractions sharp enough to wound everyone hard, and though she had advised Claire in expedience of precluding contributory damage, she understood that some fallout was necessary. Formally deception reached a certain scale, especially when it bisected with power. As Victor Newman came apprehensive of irregularities connected to Holden's gambles, his interest stoned snappily, not driven by moral outrage but by strategic necessity, and while he didn't yet have the full picture, his involvement gestured an escalation that couldn't be reversed, because formally Victor turned his attention to a problem. It was only a matter of time before he disassembled it fully, a reality that Victoria anticipated indeed as she braced herself for the domestic pressure that frequently followed her father's interventions. For Claire, the breaking point arrived still, in a moment of unanticipated clarity rather than dramatic battle, as she reviewed a series of dispatches and realized how precisely Holden had managed information, how every exposure had been calculated to maintain control, and in that consummation she eventually accepted that Victoria's warning hadn't been an act of dominance but a rare gesture of candor in a megacity where verity was generally weaponized, and though this acceptance brought no immediate relief, it did give Claire a measure of resoluteness, egging her to begin disentangling herself from Holden's route, step by conservative step. Indeed, as fear dallied over what he might do formally, he realized she was no longer playing her assigned part. Holden, seeing the shift but misunderstanding its cause, tried to reassert influence through charm and consolation. Ignorant that his usual tactics were losing their effectiveness, and this loss of control unsettled him further than any scuttlebutt or delayed meeting, because it suggested at a future where his manipulations no longer guaranteed fidelity, and as his frustration grew, so did the threat of misapprehension, a dangerous combination in a city that penalized weakness without mercy. Victoria, observing from hence, set contingency plans not just to neutralize Holden's trouble but to isolate Newman Enterprises from the broader reproach she suspected was imminent, coordinating discreetly with trusted abettors and buttressing boundaries that had been tested too frequently in the history, because if there was one assignment Genoa City had tutored her, it was that heads infrequently stayed contained, and the smartest move was always to assume the worst while hoping for restraint. As alliances shifted and implied trueness edged closer to daylight, Claire set up herself. Standing at a crossroads, apprehensive that distancing herself from Holden would not abolish the damage formerly done but might help deeper injuries, and though the path forward remained uncertain, she honored that survival in Genoa City needed choosing tone preservation over vision. Indeed, when that choice came too late to spare her from pain. By the time Holden realized the full extent of what he was losing, trust, access, control, the ground beneath him had formally shifted, set in. Stir by Victoria's original warning, a single moment of clarity that had protruded into a reckoning none of them could completely escape, and as the megacity continued its grim churn, one verity came insolvable to ignore, that in a world erected on secrets and power, the most dangerous backstabbings were no way the bones. Cried audibly, but the bones. Exposed still, piece by piece, until there was nowhere left to hide. As Genoa City acclimated to the subtle but unmistakable shift in its power currents, the consequences of Victoria Newman's warning continued to unfold with a perfection that felt nearly surgical, and though no public reproach had yet erupted, the emotional and strategic damage was formally unrecoverable, because the verity had a way of reshaping jest. Long before it ever reached captions, and nowhere was this further apparent than in the quiet recalibration taking place inside Newman Enterprises, where Victoria moved through meetings with stone focus, her instincts honed by times of surviving treason, no longer willing to tolerate indeed the appearance of vulnerability, and as directors tasted her heightened alert, commitment realigned consequently, exchanges docked, hypotheticals questioned, because when Victoria entered a room, carrying implied certainty, people understood that commodity abecedarian had changed. Claire, meanwhile, was in a state of suspended reckoning, her days marked by a deliberate pullout that felt both empowering and frightening, as she began to reclaim small pieces of autonomy that Holden's influence had subtly eroded, choosing distance over battle, clarity over comfort. Indeed, as the emotional cost of those choices counted heavily on her, because disentangling herself from a deception meant admitting how deeply she had been affected by it, and each step down forced her to defy not only Holden's treason but her own amenability to ignore warning signs for the sake of stability. Holden, for his part, oscillated between denial and computation, seeing that commodity had shifted beyond his control yet refusing to accept that his precisely constructed world was unraveling, and as his usual channels of consolation failed to produce the anticipated results, his responses grew sharper, less refined, revealing cracks in the charm that had formerly isolated him from dubitation. And though he continued to project confidence in public, intimately he began reassessing alliances, searching for the source of the resistance he could no longer charm down, ignorant that the true trouble lay not in any single adversary but in the accretive weight of trueness he'd long believed would remain retired. Victor Newman's involvement, formerly subtle, came decreasingly pronounced as he reviewed reports that verified his instincts. And while he abstained from immediate action, his silence carried its own imminence, signaling that he was observing, staying, and preparing, a posture that unsettled indeed seasoned players, because Victor no way moved without purpose, and his interest alone suggested that Holden's situation was far more precarious than he realized. Nikki, caught between concern and abdication, watched her family brace for impact, fating the familiar pattern of fidelity tested and boundaries executed. And though she endured for resolution that did Ent involve contributory damage. She understood that some assignments in Genoa City were learned only through loss. For Claire, the turning point arrived not through exposure or blameworthiness but through tone mindfulness, as she began to see how deeply the dynamics of control had shaped her choices, and in reclaiming her narrative she also reclaimed her capacity for judgment, resolving to step out of the murk of opinions made for her and into a unborn defined by responsibility, indeed. If that meant facing impacts she could no longer avoid. As whispers boosted and subtle documentation circulated, Holden's insulation grew more pronounced, his formerly extensive network narrowing as trust eroded, and though he tried to acclimatize by tensing his grip on remaining means, the strategy boomeranged, because fear was a poor cover for fidelity, and those who tasted his despair began distancing themselves before they could be pulled down with him. Victoria, watching these developments with an admixture of resoluteness and weariness, understood that the true cost of treason was no way confined to the betrayer, that it gurgled outward, demanding alert, immolation, and frequently painful restraint from those determined to survive it. And though she had acted decisively to cover both her family and her company, she remained acutely apprehensive that the fate would bear just as important strength as the original intervention. As days turned into weeks, the implied trueness that had formerly floated at the edges of mindfulness moved closer to full exposure, reshaping connections and reconsidering power. And while no single moment marked the end of Holden's influence or the morning of Claire's redemption, the line was unmistakable, guided by choices made in the quiet moments when courage signified further than comfort. In the end, Victoria's warning stood as the catalyst that set everything in stir, a memorial that in a megacity, erected on ambition and secretiveness, survival depended not on who cried the loudest but on who acted first, and as Genoa City continued its grim cotillion of alliances and backstabbings, one reality remained clear, that the verity, formerly conceded, could no way be contained, only endured, and those strong enough to face it would eventually decide who remained standing when the fallout eventually settled. Indeed, as Holden plodded to recapture footing, Claire set up herself sluggishly reconstructing a sense of tone that had been lowered by times of subtle manipulation and half-trueness, and the process was neither direct nor effortless, because every memory she redefined, every comma she replayed, carried the echo of deception, making it insolvable to separate hurt from sapience, treason from clarity. She started noticing the little effects the way Holden's respects frequently came with qualifiers that subtly undermined her confidence, the way his attention would waver when she sought genuine closeness, the way opinions that affected both of them were framed to appear mutually salutary but always favored his own interests. Each disclosure brought an admixture of wrathfulness and anguish, but also an unanticipated clarity, a consummation that the world she had been navigating alongside Holden was structured around his gain, not hers, and that acknowledgement, painful as it was, came the foundation for her coming way. Sluggishly, cautiously, she began setting boundaries, small bones. At first, delaying responses, maintaining professional distance, refusing to discover particular information, and each act of tone preservation, though minor on the face, felt revolutionary, a recovery of control over a life she realized had been subtly told by another for far too long. Meanwhile, Victoria's presence impended in ways that couldn't be ignored. She hadn't just delivered a warning, she had orchestrated a terrain in which both Claire and Holden were forced to defy the reality of their choices. Victoria's tactics were scrupulous and strategic, the capstone of decades spent managing heads where emotion and business bisected dangerously. Every move she made, whether directly visible or behind the scenes, created pressure points that impelled honesty, responsibility, or retreat. For Claire, this was both a lifeline and an added weight, a constant memorial that protection frequently came with consequences, and that in Genoa City, deliverance was infrequently effortless or immediate. Yet indeed, as Claire scuffled with the counter-accusations, there was gratefulness buried beneath the fear. Victoria's warning, delivered with perfection and authority, had created space for Claire to reclaim her agency before the damage came irrecoverable. Holden, by discrepancy, was beginning to understand that charm alone was no longer sufficient to maintain influence. The formerly dependable tools of persuasion, overpraise, subtle intimidation, calculated affection, were failing, replaced by strange resistance, adjubitation. He'd no way encountered from those closest to him. His misapprehensions were compounding daily, his frustration mounting as he realized that every attempt to reassert control produced dwindling returns. Workers, familiarity, indeed casual abettors began keeping a measured distance.